into our first statewide staff room meeting for the term. Please be aware that today's session is being recorded, as you just heard, and including the comments in the group chat. If you haven't already, please type into the group chat your name and school. If there's a group of you, can you please also add everyone's name and school? This is important data which will help us keep track of who's attending. I'll be leading today's presentation with Chanel, Elizabeth, and Corina in the chat. Please feel free to type into the chat at any time, or if you prefer, just you can save your comments and questions for the end. Just a couple of housekeeping tips. This is a one-way session, so as I just mentioned, please ensure that your microphones are muted and the camera off. We will add a presentation and a recording of this session to our website, Languages New South Wales blog, Yammer, and Facebook for anyone who is unable to attend this afternoon. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we are meeting today and pay my respects to elders past, present, and future, and the importance of observing the cultures, customs, and traditions of Aboriginal Australia. I am delivering from the lands of the Darug people. This is a photograph of the Parramatta River, which was an important food source and meeting point before colonisation. Today, it's still a meeting point for runners, cyclists, dog walkers, and commuters. Most of you would probably recognise the area and perhaps would have gone for a stroll or two as well. Now, let me introduce you to our team if you haven't met us already. Based in Parramatta are Elizabeth Robertson, Coordinator, Languages and Culture, Evia, Languages Advisor, and Maxine, and me, both language officers. Corina and Chanel, also language officers, and they are based in the Hunter region. Between us, we have 12 languages. And broadly speaking, our role is to provide support to language teachers 7 to 12 in implementing New South Wales language syllabuses through professional learning, advice, and resources. Now, we're all here to support you through various means, such as Facebook, email, our blog, Languages New South Wales, Twitter, and of course, Yammer, our statewide staff room. And as people used to say, up until not too long ago, we're just a phone call away. This statewide staff room meeting contributes to 30 minutes of registered professional learning towards accreditation at proficient level and meets standard 622. You may or may not have had a chance to look at a presentation in the Languages and Culture team put in the statewide staff room on Yammer not too long ago on assessment for learning in stages 4 and 5. That body of work was predominantly framed around the need to look at assessment for learning to inform our teaching and our reporting a little bit more closely than what perhaps we have done in the past due to our changed context in 2020. Today, I will be reinforcing that same message and continue the focus on assessment for learning with more specific examples, which, as always, you are more than welcome to take, adapt, adopt, and of course, improve. Why focus on assessment for learning? Our K-10 syllabuses have a task-based approach. As we program our units of work, we think of a final task first, then backward map the learning experiences for our students to ensure they succeed at that task. Assessment for learning focuses on the stepping stones or checkpoints to find out what students know at certain points. It ensures our students are building the skills they need to successfully complete their assessment of learning. Secondly, because of the disruptions created by COVID-19, we also saw the need to rely more on our assessment for learning as a tool to inform our reporting, raising the issue of consistent teacher judgment. Our syllabuses identify 3 approaches to assessment: assessment for learning, assessment as learning, and assessment of learning. I'll just give you a quick, a couple of seconds to have a look. Assessment for and as learning are also collectively known as formative assessment. From a teacher's perspective, they both inform you of students' progress and achievements. An assessment of learning is also known as summative assessment. How you report on student achievement at your school is a school-based decision, which is informed by the department's curriculum planning and programming, assessing and reporting to parents K-12 policy. At the end of today's meeting, we'll be asking you to reflect on how your school assesses and also allow some time for questioning. I'm sure you have all heard of Dylan Wiliam, one of the world's recognized experts in formative assessment. It's important to take note of what he says in regard to formative and summative assessment. Formative and summative are not types of assessment. Instead, they are ways to use their assessment opportunities. The same assessment can be used summatively or formatively. For example, after assessing a child in mathematics, we can form a summative conclusion about a child's achievement. This child knows 50% of these number facts. And a formative one. This child would likely benefit from work at the 7 times table. There is no such thing as a formative assessment or a summative assessment. There are, instead, formative and summative uses of assessment information. Some assessments may be better for summative functions and some may be better for formative functions. But it is the inferences and not the assessments themselves, nor even the evidence generated by those assessments that are formative or summative. This little image may help you remember the difference. So let's dive right into assessment for learning, getting to know your students and planning the next steps. The concept of formative in a context means that it actually forms or shapes learning. Therefore, everything we believe about learning and our role as language educators influences our teaching. Learning is a deeply social and cultural process that involves reflection, interaction, questioning, and discussion. So let's have a look at connection points between learning and formative assessment. A focus on transfer, encouraging the application of knowledge in different contexts, identifying prior knowledge through interacting, scaffolding, and building connections. Ongoing interactive questioning and discussion that get from simple to complex, that challenge students to elaborate, that invite students to formulate in ways that shape their understanding. A focus on feedback moves the learning forward by explaining what it is that students actually need to do in order to improve. And a focus on scaffolding appropriate to the gap in understanding of the student. So let's have a look at ways to use assessment for learning in your classes. We can use assessment for learning to identify prior knowledge before beginning the course, the topic, or the unit. The information collected will help you decide where to begin and who may need support or extension. Determine your language learner groups. Students learning as a second language or additional language. Students with prior language experience. The students with background in language. Design lessons. Teaching what students already know is not the best use of time. And this is of particular relevance now as students have returned to face-to-face learning and teachers are focusing on what students need to know and must learn. Continuing from the previous slide, you can also find out how much students know at certain points. Do you need to change strategies? Do you need to extend? Know when to stop or move on? Are students ready? Or do you need to spend more time consolidating? Reward students. It's always a rewarding experience for students to realize how much they know and to set their own future learning goals. And revise. How much do students remember from unit to unit or year to year? Although we are focusing on assessment for learning and its purposes, we can't forget or dismiss the fact that assessment for learning and assessment of learning can be intricately connected. We can view the dynamics between the two as revolving doors. For example, the assessment of used in year 8 can be seen as serving a formative purpose at the beginning of year 9, and the assessment for in a unit can also be used to gather evidence for reporting purposes. Referencing Dylan William once again, quote, the same assessment can be used summatively or formatively, unquote. When using assessment for learning to inform your reporting, it's important to evaluate the assessment activities and tasks. We need to ensure that the assessment is valid. In other words, that it assesses what you want to assess. You also want it to be reliable. In other words, that it would provide you with accurate information on the student's achievement. Considering the design and the selection of assessment for learning activities and tasks is crucial. It also involves considering the quality of an activity against a number of criteria to determine if the task will be useful, fair, and appropriate. Ensure that the evidence gathered is spaced throughout the learning continuum of the unit and in the context of the learning. Consider the skills, grammar, and vocabulary are cumulative. And remember that assessment is always most effective when it's an integral part of your teaching and learning programs. Here is a simple chart to help visualize what we mean by evaluating your activities and tasks. On the left-hand side, you have questions for your consideration, such as, does the activity link directly to the task? Does this activity allow students to clearly understand and be involved in the assessment? Is the activity accessible for all students? And on the right-hand side, we have what evidence to look for. Which outcomes or objectives does it link to? If so, how does it achieve this? If not, how can I modify or adjust to make sure that it does? And the big questions are you able to use this assessment for learning activities as success checkpoints for your assessment of learning tasks? Is the information reliable for reporting? When we carefully evaluate assessment for learning opportunities and integrate them into our programs, we are considering students' cumulative knowledge and gathering strong and reliable data to inform us of student achievement and our next steps for teaching. What does this mean for us? Specifically, when planning the learning journey and the link between assessment for and assessment of learning in our programming. You have already heard me discuss assessment for learning being used as assessment of learning and vice versa when I use the analogy of the revolving doors. You have also heard me talk about the necessary elements required in assessment for learning, especially if you are to use these activities to inform reporting. So, with that in mind, let's have a look at what this means for us in a very own context of stages 4 and 5 with a backward mapping approach to programming and a task-based focus. This is a chart which you would have seen if you did the familiarization workshops or e-course designed by the Languages and Culture team. Here, it shows how to support backward mapping and plan your journey. Starting with identifying your destination, followed by establishing what success will look like, that's to say the assessment of learning, followed by identifying what students need to know to succeed, to finally planning our journey, which is about what activities, drills, skills, assessment strategies, and resources we need to get our students to their destination. What will your journey look like? What quality assessment for learning will I embed throughout the program that will provide me with the reliable information that I'm looking for, that will equip students as we move forward in the learning with the skills, the language, structures, and so on that they need to experience success? What will be the checkpoints along the way be? So let's have a look at some of the some specific examples. Here we have an assessment of learning task, which means I have established what success will look like. Students will create a bilingual menu to welcome exchange students. As part of the planning of the journey, I have to establish what knowledge and skills do my students need to know to successfully create this bilingual menu? What are the outcomes being assessed? Have I planned my assessment for learning activities? Are my assessment for learning activities aligned with my assessment of learning task? Here we have an example of 3 assessments for learning activities to be considered to support students in their journey to their final destination. The creation of a bilingual menu. The checkpoints here are to create a Google form to survey preferences, to fill in the missing words, and a comprehension activity. The activities can be simple. It's not about complexity. You understand your context. You could be managing a class of 30 year 8s. You might even be teaching combined classes. So just ensure when doing your own planning of checkpoints that you have considered the reliability and validity of the activity, the objective of the activity, the link between the assessment for learning and assessment of learning, and inclusivity. All students should be able to access the activity, and the progress should not be overestimated or underestimated because of gender, physical ability, or cultural background. Here, we're taking a closer look at a third activity, which was the comprehension. A very short comprehension, but one which supports literacy, specifically requiring linguistic comprehension and cultural understanding. I will give you a few seconds to read the activity. Still on the same comprehension activity, but now with possible variations. This activity can be modified according to the learner group as well as differentiated according to learner needs. And where it says use wisely, it's only there as a suggestion. There's a plethora of strategies you could use for comprehensions. And I have also mapped the outcomes to help you see that if you want to use this task to inform your reporting, you can easily do it. So this activity links to the final task, makes connections with intercultural understanding, is relevant and authentic in language and topic, engages the student with the issue being discussed, and allows teachers to gather evidence for reporting and ranking. Here we have another assessment of learning task. This time, students need to listen to a message from a client and create an itinerary based on their needs and requests. And I'll give you a few moments to read it, please. As far as the teacher's planning is concerned, we need to ask ourselves the same questions. What knowledge and skills do my students need to know to successfully create this itinerary? What are the outcomes being assessed? And have I planned my assessment for learning activities? Are my assessment for learning activities aligned with the assessment of learning tasks? The checkpoints here are: students listen to the message and create a profile of the client. Students research climate, transport activities, and answer questions provided by the teacher. And search in TripAdvisor for the best accommodation or activities, justifying choices. The activities are simple, with clear objectives, and link to assessment of learning. They are relevant to the final task, accurately inform while building on research skills and language. And if you wanted to use ICT, students could use Wakelet, for example, to capture and organize their research resources. In this assessment for learning activity, students need to access information and make a judgment based on what they find. This activity can also be modified for the different learner groups and abilities. For students requiring extra support, the teacher writes 2 very simple descriptions of hotels, and the students choose one with or without specification. High potential and gifted students can make justifications and judgments as to why these are the best fit for the clients. And background learners may be able to write some or all of the information in language. Once again, this activity links to the final task, is relevant and authentic in language and topic, engages the student with the issue being discussed, and allows teachers to gather evidence for reporting and ranking. That's it. This assessment of learning task has been extracted from a Stage 4 Italian sample unit. I'll give you a few moments to read it. Students are planning an outing, want to order pizza, and need to decide on what to order. It's clearly an interacting task. To support this assessment of learning as an assessment for learning, students will practice messaging each other. This task elicits information and supports vocabulary building. They can SMS, video chat, or go on Messenger chat. This is an interactive task and can be modified according to the learner groups. You can also make adjustments for those students who may need extra support or increase the level of difficulty for those who are looking for a challenge. Through this very simple starter activity, you can see that there is ample opportunity for instructional scaffolding appropriate to the gap in understanding and skills. A message here, just like the other activities, links to the final task, makes connections with intercultural understanding, is relevant and authentic in language and topic, engages the student with the issue being discussed, and allows teachers to gather evidence for reporting and ranking. The level of difficulty of this activity can also be decreased with scaffolding or increased by adding language sophistication. As you can see, the backward mapping process really helps in identifying the checkpoints in your programming and how easy it is to use these to inform student progress. So let's reflect on our practice. These are some questions we can take home. I evaluate my task. Effective assessment is part of effective teaching. I focus on what students need to know to achieve the outcomes. I select discrete mini-tasks to support learning. I select discrete mini-tasks to support backward mapping. I can select discrete mini-tasks to inform reporting. Some bigger questions. How do I currently gather evidence for reporting? Do I employ a range of assessment strategies for a range of purposes? How do I include use assessment for learning strategies in my current programs? When I plan an assessment of learning tasks, do I identify assessment for learning checkpoints to support student success? And finally, is there anything I need to do differently? This brings me to the end of the presentation. So thank you very much for joining us today. And we do hope that you have enjoyed